Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is a series of webinars that have been presented through the IPAF North America Regional Council. We have 6 of them scheduled each year. This particular webinar is on MEWP Industry Standards and Best Practices Update. The intent of this is really educational in awareness in nature. I sit as a member of ISO MEWP standards, ANSI, SAIA, US standards, and Canadian B354 MEWP standards. And they're all in progress of going through their ongoing updates, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So at least you have a perspective of the processes, where we are and where we're going. So as I mentioned, we have what we know as a suite of standards that are design, safe use, and training, 3 separate standards that are equivalent across the ISO standards, which are international, and most of those standards are kind of foundational, that most of the country standards utilize as kind of the foundation for developing country regional standards. In the US, we have the ANSI, SAIA, A92 suite of standards. And in Canada, we have the CSA B354 Canadian standards. And all of these standards are relatively developed in line with one another. So as someone who sits on all of those standards, amongst many others who do the same, the goal of creating standards really is with the intent for harmonization. That means that we're trying to have standards that are parallel with one another, whether you're in one part of the world or another. So within the goal of harmonization, we're looking for technical equivalency, consistent intent. So what is the purpose? The interoperable application across jurisdictions. It is very harmful to think that we'd have a different requirement for safe use in the US versus Canada versus European nations, etc. We want to align the responsibilities. So we don't want to go over and have in one country having a rental company have responsibilities where in another country it's the operator or it's the owner of the equipment. So we try to align the responsibilities for tasks, and we base it on risk-based decision making. So across all of our standards, these are some of the things that as members of the committee, we try to keep in mind as we're moving forward in the development of these standards. So one of the other elements that is pulled in is the purposes of our standards. And, when you're looking at one of the very, I'm going to say, simplistic goals, is to prevent personal injuries, property damage, and accidents. So we look at information in the marketplace to identify, what are the hazards associated with the equipment. In Canada, as an example, we get coroner's reports. So when they have an incident that occurs in Canada, the coroner actually goes through, does a report, and sends it to the industry standard bodies to say, here's an incident occurred. These are the things that you want to consider as you're developing your next round of standards. So there's very clear purpose within the intent of always improving safety with the standards that we are developing. When we look at the standards as a whole, there is a process that we're required to undertake. And within those, it's called a five-year periodic review. So when you're looking at the current status of standards, we have the ISO standards, which is and I'll go through the design, safe use, and standards next. And all of those were actually revised, so republished in 2024 and 2025. The ANSI SAI A92 suite of standards, we ended up having A92.20 and 22, which is design and safe use, were republished in 2021, and I'll talk about that. And the .24, which is the training standard, was published in 2018 and it was reaffirmed in 2025. And the Canadian standards, the B354 standards, were all reaffirmed in 2022. So, what does that mean? That there's a reaffirmed standard means that after 5 years, the standard had to be republished, meaning that it was reviewed and changes are made to it, or it's reaffirmed, meaning that it is republished with no changes. So, in effect, if you're looking at the A92.24 2018 reaffirmed in 2025, there's no changes to that standard that were made from when it was first published in 2018. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. So looking at the standards, as I stated, you end up having ISO standards. And the ISO standards are actually reviewed by member countries. So the US has one vote, Canada has one vote, the EU has one vote, China has one vote. So they're voted on by countries, and all of these countries bring together their perspective for this, I'm going to say, global set of standards. And excuse me. And within that, we end up having what we refer to as the suite of standards. So in the ISO case, we have 16368, which is what we refer to as the design standard. So the people who are designing and manufacturing MEWPs will refer to that particular standard. The next one is 18893, which is the safe use standard. So a machine is designed and manufactured to 16368, and then it needs to be safely used by those people who are operating that equipment in the field, and that's under 18893. And then we end up having a training standard, which is 18878 internationally, and that one, it defines how to train the safe use practices that come from the safe use standard. So that's how those three things go together, and those are paralleled in each of our countries. So in the ANSI standards, we end up having the A9220, that, as you can see, -2021. So that was republished in 2021. A92.22, the safe use standard, was republished in 2021 as well. And A92.24 was published in 2018, and that was just reaffirmed in 2025. Reaffirmed meaning that it is the same standard, same language in it that it was when it was published in 2018. The fact that we republished the 20 and 22 standards in 2021 was the result of all of these three standards being published in 2018, but A9220 and 22 ended up having an appeal put against them. So there was language in there that an appellant said, we don't think that you followed due process, or there was an issue with this. And there were two issues that needed to be addressed. And it took us from 2018 to 2021 for us to resolve those appeals and republish. And we only republished the elements that were part of that appeal. So those came out in 2021, but we still sat out with those standards in effect, not changing the bulk of language in full review as we did with the 2024 2018 standard. So all of those are really coming up for a complete review and will be looking at being republished, hopefully in 2026 or early 2027. Interestingly enough, the Canadian standards were published in 2017. And as I stated, we have this 5-year periodic review that needed to take place. So if you're looking at 2017 plus 5 years, these standards had to be republished or reaffirmed in that 5-year period of time. And in this particular case, they were reaffirmed, meaning they were republished exactly as they were originally published in 2017. And the reason that we didn't go through a review on those is the Canadian standards are one of the few countries that actually have adopted the ISO standards. So they adopt the ISO standards with Canadian deviations. And as we were going through the cycle, because we're adopting the ISO standard, we wanted to wait for the ISO standards to be republished before we then did a Canadian review, because we intended to adopt those again and with any Canadian deviations that took place. So when you're looking at the scope of the standards, currently the one that is most active now that the ISO standards have been republished are the suite of ANSI A92 standards. So again, as I stated, they were first brought forward to be published in 2018. And within that, that would say in 2023, they needed to be republished or reaffirmed. And then from there, 2028. And here we're looking at 2026. And what has occurred, as I stated, is we did republish the design and safe use standards based on the very specific requirements to change language through the appeals on two items. One was on the requirement or the prior requirement for manual responsibilities. And then secondly is on the scope of language for modifications. Those two sections were modified and were republished in 2021, but we didn't do the rest of the standard. At the same time, the training standard, which was published in 2018, was waiting to go through and be republished, but we wanted to do those in sequence. So because they were waiting for the 20 and 20, the design and safe use standards to I'm going to say catch up with them on doing a complete review, they reaffirmed, and we expect that these standards will most likely start coming up for approvals during this calendar year. And the interesting thing I would say, as someone who sits on all three of these standards, is that it at some level is like a three-tiered chess game. And what's happening is you're sitting in, and I'll use the example of the safe use standards. You're sitting in the ISO standards, working on it with a completely different group of people who represent countries from around the world, and then you're sitting in a ANSI standard, which are individuals who are associated with activities in the U.S., and then parallel with that is a group of people who are sitting in Canada on the issues that reflect what is pertinent within their region as well. And all of these changes are somewhat taking place simultaneously, and we are trying to harmonize simultaneously. So it is a challenge at some level based on the flow of when these are being reviewed, who is sitting on the standards, who sits on multiple standards, and conveying the information moving forward. So it is a moving target that we're trying to achieve this level of harmonization. So when you look at it from a timeline concept, you're looking at us going through the ISO standards. And as I stated, we just went through a complete review of those, and they were published in 2024 and 2025. At the same time, we end up having the ANSI standards, which is the US-based standards, and those standards were focused prior to 2021 on getting up the appeal language, getting them, I'm going to say finally published, addressing those issues that we had conflicts with. And So as we're doing that, we were also knowing that we were working with ISO standards, that we're moving ahead, having information that we can share there, trying to infiltrate that as we're continuing to do drafting on those standards for the next revisions. And as I said, last but not least, were the Canadian standards, which are an adoption of the ISO standards. And as a byproduct, if you're going to adopt them, you don't want to go through a review until the ISO standards were republished so that you have a new baseline to do your review and identify any specific Canadian deviations that you want to put in place. So it really is somewhat of a juggling routine if you're involved with these things globally. And if you think about it from the concept of, oh, why do I care if I'm in the US? Or why do I care if I'm in Europe and not dealing in the US or even across the Canadian border? So if you think about it from this perspective, think about a machine that's being designed with a completely different design standard. So I'm a manufacturer and I have a different requirement for the design of a piece of equipment that's in Canada than it is in the US. So it would be compliant in the US, but not in Canada or vice versa. You don't want to be making different machines that can virtually go across these borders. And even on the global market, if you're looking at how we sell used equipment and they go to auction, you can't move a piece of equipment from one country to another. And the one thing, excuse me again, and the one thing that I would point out to you is that in 2017 and 18, when the US and Canadian standards started to model to the ISO standards, we then started bringing about this real harmonization that made machines from a design and manufacturing perspective much more closer, so that in the past you couldn't bring a machine that was designed to an ANSI standard to Europe or one that was made to a European standard into the US. Now that we are harmonizing to an ISO-based global standard, the difference between country standards is relatively small. So now you can see that there's this ability for us to move equipment from country to country. And if you are an observer of what's changed in the marketplace, you'll find that in the US marketplace, in the Canadian marketplace, you'll find a lot more foreign manufacturers coming into the country. And that's because they're able to now make one machine that can meet the requirements of multiple country standards. Parallel with that, I'd go over and say, if you think about it from a safe use perspective, do you want to get to the point where in one country you're required to wear personal fall protection on boom lifts, but not in another country? So the harmonization in these requirements from manufacturing to safe use and training really do parallel across country borders much more easily today as we become a much more global market. So I'm going to now talk about a couple of how these things parallel across our standards and how things are changing. So when you're thinking about what's going on, if I were someone who is not a manufacturer of equipment, probably not going to spend a lot of time and energy reading and understanding the design standards. That's up to the manufacturers to understand and be compliant with those requirements. However, when a change takes place within a design standard, some of those will have impact when you're looking at the next set of equipment purchases you make. Now, I can't specifically speak about what changes are being discussed within standards because those are confidential conversations, and they really will not be able to be seen until the standard is approved and they're put out into the marketplace. And generally, that will happen for the first time when it's approved by the subcommittee, goes to the consensus body, which is the voting body at either the ANSI SAIA level or the CSAB 354 level, and then it goes out for public comment. When it goes out for public comment, they then become open for discussion and making people aware of them. In this particular case, I'm going to show you that one of the elements that are in the marketplace today are what's known as intelligent anchors. So what's occurred, and I go back to the prior oration I made on looking at standards with the purpose to eliminate incidents and accidents associated with the use of these products. One of the things that we know is we continue to have falls from work platforms. Despite the fact that we end up having current language that says on all boom type lifts, you are required to wear personal fall protection in addition to the fully guardrail platform. And when we're looking at our accident data, we can identify that despite the fact that we end up having these requirements in place, we still have falls that are occurring from boom type platforms. And within that scope, discussion has taken place about, is there a way for us to go over and put some type of a alarm on the anchorage devices that can identify if someone forgot to connect. As a practitioner myself, I will tell you that there are times when I've got in and out of a boom lift, changing lights at my parish church. And in the process of doing that, getting in and getting out, getting in and out, and even though I'm a well-trained and subject matter expert, there will be a moment that I may have forgotten to reconnect. And so it's not a function of not being trained. It's not a function of wanting to circumvent rules and regulations. It's a function of human beings being human. In this particular case, this language has been discussed. And while it's being discussed, there are people who have identified that, wow, this is something that we think is a change that's going to take place. So despite the fact that currently today, there's no standard that has a requirement for intelligent anchorages, there are at least 5 companies who have come up with devices that provide what we will refer to today as an intelligent anchorage. If you're looking at this is one of multiple things that are in standards. If I go back to the 2018 design standard, one of the things that took place then was we used to be able to have a chain gate across the mid-rail of platforms. And that has changed. And now you must have a fixed railing on the entrance to all platforms. The fact that that went into effect is in standards today, may not be in all country standards, but manufacturers see those. It starts to then become a common device that you're going to see in the marketplace. And then in contrast, when we make these changes, they aren't necessarily retroactive on the design side. Matter of fact, they are not retroactive. So if you had a machine that was manufactured to a prior standard where the chains were allowed, they will stay in the marketplace until those machines go through their life cycle and are not in active operation anymore. So these are the types of changes that are going on, and being aware of those, know that some of these things are coming in even before a standard requires them. Secondary guarding, what we call the anti-crushing devices, you're going to see that there wasn't a requirement necessarily in any of the standards, but manufacturers started putting those on as standard equipment and many of the boom type lifts throughout the marketplace. These are the things that again are evolving while we're developing and implementing industry standards. Another new term that was introduced into the U.S. ANSI SAIA standards is MEWP supervisors. So when we're looking at the systemic issue of training and the safe use for products, we ended up having, these buckets that were over there, which was we ended up having the user, which is, I'm going to say, a parallel for employers. And within the scope of that, the user had all these responsibilities to do things, and the operator had responsibilities to do things. We got very focused in on once the operator gets trained, everything is good. But there were a lot of things that are the responsibility of the employer uh, that needed to take place. And in the U.S. market, we said, well, there's the person who directly oversees the MEWP operators is the person who's closest, who if they have a problem, they're going to report to. And we created this MEWP supervisor, so the person who operators directly report to. And we end up having a requirement for MEWP supervisor training. And there's a whole sequence of things that occur with that. As that was introduced into the ANSI standards in 2018, other standards were silent on that particular issue. You'll find that the new ISO standard, the safe use standard, actually now has supervisor and supervisor training requirements within that standard. And as I stated, the next sequence that is coming forward is the Canadian standards, who are going to now be reviewing to update their standards, which is an adoption of those ISO standards, will now be introduced. So there's this element that's out there that's already in marketplaces that we have people who have been taking action on already that are coming, and you should get yourself prepared for it and be aware of these changes that are taking place. While prior to 2017, we used to have standards that were, I'm going to say, silos. So they were based on products. So there was a standard for vertical lifts, scissor lifts, for self-propelled booms, for push around verticals. And within each of those standards had the design, safe use, and training requirements. In 2017 plus, standards introduced a training standard itself. And within that training standard, it talked about what's the content that needs to be in the training, who is qualified to deliver that training, what's the environment that the training needs to take place in, the difference between theory knowledge, like classroom, instructor-led training, which now is allowed to also be used with online e-learning. And when you complete that, hands-on practical training. So as we looked at that, we went over and again, as we're looking at this in a systemic approach, knowing that users and supervisors have their responsibilities, we are looking at it in saying the training itself, and now that we have a training standard, is not the finish line to say that an individual is qualified. So we now are introducing language that says that in order for you to be a qualified operator just doesn't mean that I was trained one day and now the journey is over and now I'm qualified to do anything. It's that there's continuous evaluations. There are different skill levels, how often you use things, what is your experience, the breadth and depth of machines that are in the marketplace. So when you're looking at the ongoing language that's attached with it, it really is understanding that there's much more that needs to take place to be a qualified operator than just undertaking an operator training class. By definition, within our standards, training enables one to become qualified. It doesn't make them qualified. So the key term there is it enables one to become qualified. So as we're looking at it, that's one of the enablers. What are the other elements? And we're looking at more details to look at the responsibility to do ongoing supervision and evaluation on an ongoing basis of operators to ensure their competency. So there's lots of things that are going into this process of continuous safe use of these products than just an event. So within the scope of that, if you're looking at it, we have training for the operator. We also have what's known as retraining, and retraining has its own definition, but retraining is added knowledge based on the employer's observations to bring them up to speed. So these are things like toolbox talks, uh, making sure that they continually are getting educated. If you identify that an incident occurred on the job site, you may take your whole group and go through and focus in on a very specific area of hazards that may be on your job sites. So that would be retraining, and then last but not least, it's renewal, and renewal is training again. So it's going through that training course again. So it really is trying to have this broad understanding of the cycle of knowledge that needs to be put in place in order for an operator to maintain their proficiencies. So my general conversation with all of you is that as we have ISO standards and ANSI, SAIA, A92 standards for the US, CSA B354 standards in Canada, these things are constantly in review and development. They're not all necessarily being done at the same time. You may see something happening in one of those before the others, and that will typically be the case. So it really is important for you to be aware of what changes are taking place in each of these standards, because they will at some level be looked at for harmonization across the globe and making sure that we are all doing things relatively the same way, regardless of where in the world we're operating this equipment. So this is kind of where we're at right now. Again, I can go back and just say that uh, the ISO standards are already published. You can get access to those and really get a sense of what's going on worldwide. The Canadian standards will be reviewing those, and they're going to start that review this year with the expectation that as they've been published in 2022, 5 years from now, so in 2027, we should be republishing the new series of B354 standards. And then in the background, while we have that, we have this parallel that we're so close that we want to have real harmonization between the ANSI A92 standards and the Canadian B354 standards. And while the US standards are not an adoption, there can be some variations that are in there, and we need to make sure that there's nothing in there that is substantive that would make those different. One of the things that I always try to point out to anybody is that the SAIA is the secretariat of the ANSI A92 standards, which means they control those and ensure that in the development of those standards, they comply with all of the ANSI requirements for development of consensus standards. And within the scope of that, the SAI has developed what are known as manual of responsibilities. And they have one for the A92.22 and 24 standards. And again, 2021 is the current publication. You can buy this, which is an exact copy of the standard responsibilities that are in those standards for $7.95 each. So you can go on, if you don't have a copy of the safe use and training standard in the US, and that's an area of concern for you, you can buy a copy for $7.95. Whereas if you bought the standards are $55 each. So if you're looking to buy the safe use and training standard, that's $110 versus $7.95. So I'm just giving you that as a piece of information. If you're not aware of it, that you can buy a copy of those and be aware of the current standards that apply in the marketplace until the new standards are republished. So that's kind of a scope of where we're at. So the ISO standards are republished. The Other country standards are to refer to those, to try to become as close to those as possible. The ANSI A92 standards are far down the road and are in a position where we're ready to push those forward to the main consensus body to begin the process of being republished. Uh, those I expect that will start taking place in this calendar year. So if we're looking at, we have a design, safe use, and training standard, all separate standards that have to go through the body. I'm going to say, it's going to take some time. So they'll probably be sequenced like every other month of something of that nature. So it may leak into 2027 before we finally get to the point where they're published. In that process, you could have individuals come through and make comments on those that need to be readdressed, that can push the process out further. But ultimately, that these standards are being changed and will be coming out in the coming year or so. The Canadian standards, as I stated, are an adoption of the ISO standards. Now that the ISO standards have been published, they will go through and do a review for those to see if they can adopt those with as minimal amount of Canadian deviations as possible, with the hope that they will be published in that 5-year cycle, which is from 2022 plus 5 years, 2027. So that's where we are with those standards. Now, I'd also provide you with awareness of industry best practices. So in 2010, 2012, the industry actually created what we call MEWP statements of best practices for MEWPs. And within those, we end up having 3 basic best practices. We had one on training, one on developing rescue plans, and the third one was identifying the proper personal fall protection for use with mobile elevated work platforms. So we had these 3 best practices that were put in place. So standards are performance based. So a standard's going to go over and saying, you need to do this in training, you need to cover this in training, then this needs to be done, and this is how you're going to measure performance. And it's performance based. And if you went over and said, how long would it take to do that training? Well, a standard will say it's performance based. You need to do, when you complete these tasks, then you will be done. A best practice can go over and just saying that as we're looking at the processes that are being defined in the standards, we believe that it should take this long to do this, and they can put in there 6 hours, 8 hours, 6 to 10 hours. So a best practice can be much more pragmatic, and I'm going to say establishing what is normally done, the norms in the industry. So as I would say, it fills the gaps where standards may be silent or non-specific. So when we're looking at it in the back, this picture that you can see along the side is kind of a picture of the one of the existing best practices. And these were contributed by multiple industry associations. So we're going through a new revision of all of these 3 best practices. And my expectation is we should get these out this year. And because they were written in 2010, 12, we've had multiple industry standards be published since they were initially put out, which means that they needed to be updated as well. And that's why we're going through this process to update this industry best practices. Currently, we have the American Rental Association, AEM, the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, Scaffold and Access Industry Association, the Canadian Rental Association, and IPAF as the 5 associations that are endorsing these new best practices. These are a work in progress. They'll go over there and, as I said, provide you with this information, and they're free. So these will be available at every one of these industry associations for you to use at your will. And here I gave you an example of one of the detailed measures that you'll see in the training best practice. And here you'll see that how long should it take? So for training, you're going to look at theory, the classroom or online training should take about 2 to 4 hours, and the practical hands-on will take 3 to 6 hours. So you're looking at it taking anywhere from 5 to 10 hours to do operator training. And again, the variable is based on how many people, how many different categories of equipment are involved with it, etc. And then we end up having familiarization, which is I'm trained on a classification of products. Familiarization is model specific familiarization. So I have a driver's license for a car, but when I go and rent it, I go out and I pull out and I don't know how to turn the windshield wipers on or where the light switches. That's the familiarization of the controls and operating characteristics of that specific model. And when we wrote the first training best practice, what we identified in the marketplace as a need was the difference between training and familiarization. So we would go over there and we would hear people saying, "Oh, that training that the rental companies give me when you drop it off is crap." And I went someplace else and they did something for an hour, and oh, that's really what you need. That's really good training. What I just described, neither of those were training, but familiarization is what takes place when the machine is dropped off. It's model specific familiarization about the controls and operating characteristics of that machine. Training is much more detailed and it covers safe use practices, identification of hazards, and hazard prevention. Much more detailed. So here you'll see us in the standard, or excuse me, in this best practice talk about these things. However, today, when we're looking at what is the substance or the purpose of this document, it's saying we need to now go over and expand what operator qualifications are. So it's not just a function of saying, I went over and sent someone to a 1 day course or whatever period of time it took to go through that operator training. And now, check, this person is qualified. And now it's like a journey, it's done. And what we're saying, or excuse me, with an event, it's done. It's, I've reached the destination. And really what's happening is we've identified that it's a continuation of knowledge and evaluations. They need to be monitored, supervised, and evaluated on an ongoing basis. And that language comes directly from our existing standard. So it really is trying to provide much more detailed for people to understand what and how they apply those standards in the marketplace. So these will be coming out in the course of 2025, and it would be my expectation that we may expand and start introducing additional industry best practices. In fact, we've identified rescue planning being an area that we believe an industry best practice would serve the industry well. So these are the things that are coming. Again, anybody who is engaged as a subject matter expert is open to applying to participate in industry drafting standard development. And as I mentioned, the breadth of associations that are involved with the development and update of the industry best practices, you too can raise your hand and say, geez, I know that you're working through these things. I'd like to be involved with those. Please contact any of the associations, including me directly, to get your voice involved with those. So at this point in time, that concludes this presentation. I hope that it provided you with some valuable information, raised awareness for you. If anybody has any questions, there is a Q&A, and I'm trying to find it on my slot. I can't. Chat. Anna, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I can see the question in the Q&A box, but I don't see any questions.
Okay. So if anybody has any questions, this would be the time to type those in. So I'll give you a minute to do that.
Yeah, so we have something from David Weffler. Greetings, Tony, great information. Can you elaborate on there not being a hard and fast expiration like there are for forklift standards?
Can you type that into the chat box? Because
Yeah, I'll type it here.
we just cut and paste it.
Yeah.
Why there are not hard and fast expirations. We The assumption that I'm making with that is that there is not a hard and fast expiration on the design standard side. So if you think about it, you have a very detailed requirement within the design standards, and literally there are certain times when you'd have to remanufacture a machine in order to make an old design standard compliant with a new design standard requirement. Uh, so they have really what's happening is they've come over and said you are grandfathered. So when a machine is manufactured, designed and manufactured to an existing standard, which was appropriate at that point in time, it never says that it now is, I'm going to say, not safe, but we're adding additional safety to it. So that's the breakout. When it comes to the safe use and training requirements, those go into effect immediately when when the standard goes into effect. So safe use and training go into effect immediately upon the effective date of the standard. But on the design standard size, it's retroactive because some of those can never be brought up to speed without redoing the complete machine. Any other questions?
Yes, I type it into the chat box.
All right. What do you think during working on MEWPs is FBH is mandatory? I don't know what FBH is. So if you can define what FBH.
Well, we have another question just in the meantime.
Who would be the best contact for inquiry for information to be able to join the ANSI committee that writes the standards? In that particular case, that would be the Secretariat of the Scaffold and Access Industry. Their email address would be, or their website is www.saiaonline.org. And if you contacted me, and I will go to my last slide. Oops, sorry. There is my email address. If you get a hold of me, I will put you in contact with them as well. So Abdul, did you type in what FBH is?
Full body harness.
Okay, thank you. What do you think during working on MEWPs is full body harness mandatory? The answer is that there are some MEWPs that require, which are, I'm going to say, a single man basket vertical lifts that only require fall restraint. And when you have fall restraint, you would not necessarily be required to have a full body harness. However, I would say when we're looking at the new requirements from the Z350 359 standards for fall protection, I believe that it's a Class A harness is going to be required specific for all boom type operations or any MEWP operation that a fall would be put in place. So a full body harness is a requirement. What are your thoughts on the use of simulators to ensure competency as well as training and testing? Right. So I'm going to so the question here is, what are my thoughts on the use of simulators to ensure competency as well as training and testing? The answer is that I think that simulators and there's a wide range of what could be defined as a simulator in the marketplace, but I believe that simulators are a substantive tool that can enhance the ability for our industry to be able to effectively provide measurements for competency within the specific requirements for all of our industry standards. The standard bodies have been very specific that in regards to operator training specifically, that a simulator will not be able to replace hands-on practical training. So from a standard definition, I would say while they could be used within training, they cannot be used currently with today's language to eliminate the need for being directly on a machine during the practical training sessions. Uh, that being said, as I mentioned prior, what does it mean for someone to maintain their qualifications? And while we have training, this ongoing, evaluation of how do we evaluate people? What's the appropriate way of doing that? Uh, Simulators are a fantastic tool that can be very, I'm going to say, pure in their ability to evaluate an individual. So if I had three instructors, you could go over there and have one who's soft as a marshmallow, one who's hard as nails, and someone's in between. And when you have those types of human interaction, you have the potential of having some discrepancies. Whereas with a simulator, which is very programmable, it's going to be much more objective. So I think that there's a place for it in our marketplace. I think that the industry itself has to embrace it because right now it's a challenge to get people uh, to appropriate compliant training. To add in another element to this is something that the market itself has to develop an appetite for to embrace it. Depends on the laws of each country. So I'm not sure whether we're referring to the full body harness or the simulators. The answer is the laws of the land are the laws of the land. So you could have a different requirement and from one place to another. Um, but those are the foundations. So even industry standards are voluntary consensus requirements unless they're adopted by law. So laws are laws. Standards are basically to be followed as as they're appropriate within your markets. So I would say uh, that would be the kind of direction that the standards state, and we would follow as well. How we how we control mute? Sure. Abdul, I'm not sure that I'm following. How do we control mute jerk? I think mute man lift, scissor lifts, also designed for uneven surfaces. The answer is the design standards define uh, for a manufacturer their ability to be stable, and there's lots of specific requirements in there, whether they're mobile or not mobile, whether they're giving an allowable um, slope that they can operate on or grade ability. So all of those are really clearly defined within the standards for manufacturers to adhere to. And when they define what those are, then the safety standards say that you need to adhere to those in the safe operation of the equipment. I hope I answered that correctly for you.
I don't see any more questions.
Okay. So I'll go back to, I appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully this brought some value to you. You have my contact information on the screen below. So if there's questions that come up later on, feel free to contact me at any point in time. Last but not least, this is a recorded session, so this will be available for future views. So if you find there's a value to it and someone within your organization wasn't available to see it today, this will be available for it to be viewed at a future point in time. With no other questions, the session is adjourned. Thank you for your time and attention.